6 days a week, at precisely 1 o'clock, this gun signals the passing of time. The battlements on which this ritual takes place stand on an awesome rock which has witnessed the passing of so much time. A rock whose origins belong to an age long before mankind walked in its shadow. It is a fitting place for a great fortress and a royal residence whose legendary story has become the story of the kingdom over which it stands sentinel. The kingdom is Scotland. The castle is Edinburgh. The majestic setting of Edinburgh Castle was created by nature at its most powerful, in a process which began some 340 million years ago, when molten rock burst through the Earth's crust to create a huge volcano. Millions of years later, in the ice ages which followed, the volcano and its surrounding rocks were worn down by great sheets of ice until only the solid basalt feeder pipe remained as an impenetrable obstacle. The ice, moving from west to east, flowed around it, gouging out great areas in its path. But the solid basalt protected the softer rocks to the east, and when the streams finally met up again, they had created one of the finest examples in the world of the geological formation known as a crag and tail. To us, the Castle Rock and Edinburgh's famous Royal Mile. Today, the Royal Castle of Edinburgh is a powerful symbol of Scotland itself, attracting thousands of visitors with its grandeur and its spectacle. For where nature had carved the raw materials of creation, man pursued his destiny. The mighty fortress which he built over the centuries has a story to tell which captivates the imagination and stirs the heart as much as the vision of the castle and rock commands the eye to gaze in wonder. We may have to turn back the clock as much as 8,000 years to reveal man's first presence on the Castle Rock, to a time when the ground was boggy and the surrounding landscape densely wooded. The people whose eyes might first have dwelled on this scene would have been Stone Age hunters and gatherers. We can't be sure, but we do have evidence for a settlement on the rock in the late Bronze Age, some 3,000 years ago. After a period of decline, the hilltop settlement grew again to thrive in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, by which time the Romans had established the Antonine Wall, the most northerly frontier of their empire, a little to the west of what is now Edinburgh. The Romans traded with the native Votadini, and it's this tribe, later known as the Gododin, who first recorded the name Dunedin, the stronghold of Eden, shortly before AD 600, when in the hall on the top of the rock, their war band pledged themselves to die in the service of their lord, the local King Mynadog. And die they did, on a raid south into the land of the Angles. The Gododin retreated, and after the pursuing Angles had besieged and taken Dunedin in 638, the stronghold took on the English name of Edinburgh. Edinburgh's castle was never destined for a minor role in Scottish history. Built on a mountainous volcanic rock itself forged by the most formidable forces of nature, shaped by succeeding generations and always dominating its surroundings in the most majestic way, this is a truly awesome place. And yet, for all its magnificence, what you see on the outside is merely the product of the last 400 years. The rest of the story, Scotland's story, is hidden away, waiting to be unlocked on a journey which takes the visitor from this gateway upward to the summit of the rock and the very heart of the castle, 134 meters above sea level. It's a journey which takes us back and forth through time to reveal the castle's history as a fortress, a garrison, which it still is, a royal residence, and a place of momentous happenings. The crag and tail formation gives Edinburgh Castle its great strength and its one significant weakness. Its siting on top of the crag makes it virtually impregnable, except here, on the east side, where the area occupied by the sloping Royal Mile offers a comfortable approach. Such ease of access, compared to the fearsome face of the rest of the rock, has in time of war presented the weakest point in the defensive ring. But in times of peace, this comparatively gentle incline was a welcome way in, and the eastern side has always housed the main gateway to the castle. The present gatehouse is impressive, but has little to do with defences. It was built by the Victorians in the most fashionable Scots baronial style to replace a simple 17th century entrance gate. The intention was to make the castle look more picturesque. And dating from the 17th century are two carved stone panels in the entrance passageway. They depict artillery, powder barrels and gun stones. One shows Mons Meg, the massive 15th century cannon now housed in the castle vaults. A bronze statue of Scotland's great hero Robert the Bruce is one of two added in 1929 to commemorate the 600th anniversary of his death. He and Sir William Wallace, another great patriot from Scotland's bitter struggles against the English, look out across the familiar esplanade and parade ground where peace now reigns supreme. Through the gateway is the castle's lower ward or division, from where the cobbled hill begins its sloping upward journey. The impressive sight of the castle soaring above begins to unfold here. The road was originally built to make it easier for soldiers to trundle their heavy guns in and out of the castle. The much altered 17th century inner barrier was once a formidable additional obstacle fronted by a drawbridge and ditch between the outer and inner gates. The medieval entrance to the castle was situated where the old guardhouse now stands. Built in 1853 for the castle guard, it was later extended to house detention cells and then became a store when the Victorian gatehouse was completed 35 years later. Today, it makes an admirable shop for the 1 million people who visit the castle every year. The origins of the Portcullis Gate characterize the rise and fall of the castle's fortunes. The harrowing story of the Long Siege, or better known as the Lang Siege in Scots, which wrought great damage to the vulnerable East Front, is a tale to be told from a higher vantage point in the castle. But this splendid and inspiring entrance gate was built by the Regent Morton to replace the 14th century Constable's Tower, devastated under bombardment before the siege came to an end in 1573. The gate was a substantial barrier with two outer doors, an inner door and a portcullis. The hearts and Earl of Douglas five-pointed stars in the triangular-headed panel above the Renaissance gateway are the arms of the fourth Earl of Douglas, Regent Morton. The shield with the royal arms of Scotland and the decorative upper half of the gateway were added as part of its restoration in the 1880s, as the masonry clearly shows. The portcullis, incidentally, is modern. In the Middle Ages, the main fortified part of the castle was on the summit of the great rock and was reached by a flight of 40 steps. The present more challenging Lang stairs contain an additional 30 steps and were built in 1785 by prisoners of war held captive in the castle. The cobbled road passes through the castle's middle ward and provides a less arduous route to the top. The middle ward was open ground and pasture in medieval times. It was developed from the 15th century mainly for light industrial work such as blacksmithing and other activities associated with the military and its arsenal. From its battlements facing north, the middle ward affords one of the most spectacular views in all Scotland. The panorama is dominated by the estuary and the wide sweep of the Firth of Forth. Beyond lies the kingdom of Fife, and further still, the peaks of distant mountains. Below, in a splendour of its own, stands the capital city of Edinburgh. The principal artillery defence on this north side of the castle was the Argyll or six-gun battery named after the second Duke of Argyll, who commanded George I's army in 1715 to defeat the Jacobites at the Battle of Sheriffmuir. After the Rising, the battery was rebuilt in its present form in the 1730s on the recommendation of Major General George Wade, best known for his military roads in the Scottish Highlands. The domed sentry boxes were the work of Captain John Romer, who designed mighty Fort Augustus in the Great Glen. The guns are cast-iron muzzle-loading 18-pounders made during the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century. The Argyll battery operated in conjunction with the low defence below it, and to its west the Mills Mount battery, where the 1 o'clock signal gun is positioned and is fired every day except Sunday. Scotland owes its most audible of time signals to John Hewitt, an Edinburgh businessman who in 1846 was so impressed by a similar practice in Paris that he campaigned for something like it in his home city. Eventually, his suggestion that the time ball on the Calton Hill Nelson Monument, intended as a visual signal for ships in the port of Leith, should be accompanied by an audible indication, was accepted. The first firing was in June 1861, and apart from the 2 world wars, the custom has continued uninterrupted ever since. 4 men were needed to fire the original 64-pounder from the castle's higher half-moon battery, but the present gun on Mills Mount is a Second World War 25-pounder, and 1 man can do the job admirably. For special occasions, such as royal birthdays, a 21-gun salute is fired. This particular 21-gun salute was in honour of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, given annually on the occasion of his birthday, the 17th of June. It is perhaps appropriate that the castle's cafe and restaurant is housed in this building, a former shed for carts which brought provisions to the garrisoned troops from the city below. But there's more to this location than immediately meets the eye. Archaeological excavations in the area in 1988 and 1989 unearthed the foundations of a 17th century storekeeper's house, demolished to make way for the cart shed. The excavations were conducted in advance of work on a vehicle tunnel, which now runs beneath the well-worn cobblestones. It was then that the archaeologists made their startling discoveries, which enabled them to push back the story of man's occupation of the rock by 3,000 years to the Bronze Age. The artifacts and structural remains included large circular houses built around 200 BC. The middle ward reflects the military presence, which is still very much a part of Edinburgh Castle. The governor's house was built in 1742 as the official residence of the castle governor, with lodgings in 2 wings for the master gunner and the storekeeper. The post of governor was abolished in 1860, and the building was then used by the nursing sisters of the castle hospital. Today, the central block serves as the army officers' mess, with the north wing reserved for the governor, a crown appointment restored for purely ceremonial purposes in 1935. Work started on the massive new barracks in 1796, the year Napoleon married Josephine, at a time when Britain was at war with revolutionary France. It was completed in 1799 to provide sufficient accommodation for an infantry battalion of 600 officers and men. Foog's Gate is both an ancient structure and a portal to the past. It leads to the highest part of the rock, to the summit, and to the heart of the medieval castle. Foog's Gate dates from the 1600s. How it got its name is less certain. Earlier references to Foggy Gate suggest it might relate to the thick sea mist called a haar, which often envelops the castle rock. For 300 years, this has been the main gateway to the castle's upper ward, in ancient times reached by the more difficult ascent via the punishing Lang stairs. The thick wall on either side of the gate contains gun holes and musket loops, and was part of the defensive works built in King Charles II's reign in the wake of Oliver Cromwell's seizure of the castle in 1650. Our journey to the upper ward takes us even further back in time as the story of Edinburgh Castle, the story of Scotland, continues to unfold. The oldest surviving structure from the medieval castle is also one of the most beautiful. The story of St. Margaret's Chapel, standing on the highest point of the castle rock, reveals a touching human tale and the dawning of the royal castle. On November the 16th, 1093, the saintly Queen Margaret returned from Mass to her chamber in the castle to learn that her husband, King Malcolm III, and their eldest son had been killed by the English at the Battle of Alnwick in Northumberland. Already ill, she was heartbroken, and the tragic news caused her death. King David I, the youngest of Margaret's 6 sons, built the tiny Romanesque chapel around 1130, and may well have dedicated it to his mother, who was canonized in 1250. This is a copy of her gospel book. During her reign, Margaret did much for the spiritual life of the nation, and she's also commemorated in one of the stained glass windows, more recently added in 1922. The chapel is divided by a fine chevron-decorated arch. On one side, a semicircular chancel houses the altar and was reserved for the priest officiating at Mass. This private oratory for the royal family ceased to be used as a chapel by the 16th century and was converted into a gunpowder magazine. Its original purpose was rediscovered in 1845, after which it was beautifully restored to its present condition. It's still in use today for services. Although only the little chapel of St. Margaret has survived, the castle on the summit was well established by the reign of David I as a royal residence, incorporating a storehouse, the sheriff's headquarters, and a prison. That nothing else remains from that time is the responsibility of the nation's great hero, Robert the Bruce. 46 years after Margaret was canonized, the castle fell to the hammer of the Scots, King Edward I of England, following his invasion of the country, and a large garrison was installed. The bloody wars of independence followed as the Scots fought to regain their kingdom. Although the wars continued, the English grip on Scotland weakened after the death of Edward, and in the spring of 1314, a daring nighttime raid was staged by the Scots. Led by Sir Thomas Randolph, the Earl of Murray, and Bruce's nephew, a group of 30 men, picked for their courage and daring, scaled the dangerous north precipice, illuminated only by the moonlight. They succeeded in taking the English garrison and the occupants by surprise, so recapturing the castle for Scotland. The stark outcome was that once his men were in possession, Bruce ordered the dismantling of the defences to render them useless and prevent any reoccupation by the English. Shortly after, his army went on to rout the old enemy at the famous Battle of Bannockburn. Such bravery and heroism was the very stuff of kingdoms and castles, but the ability to hold and defend a fortress, or merely to survive within its walls, relied on securing the essentials, without which life itself could not be sustained. Providing fresh drinking water on top of an extinct volcano was a particular problem. Next to the formidable defences of the 5-gun 4-wall battery is the 4-well, dating from at least the 14th century. It was cut through 34 metres of solid rock, and yet only the bottom 3 metres have ever held water, and then barely sufficient to sustain the garrison in time of siege, around 11,000 litres. Worse, it seems the water level actually fell when the nearby heavy guns were fired in anger, just when a secure water supply was most needed. As the castle grew and the population expanded, so did the demand for water. The back well was cut in 1628. It was just 2.5 metres deep and collected water that drained off the rock. It fell into disuse in the 19th century when a piped supply was installed from the town. The Victorian hand pump is a recent addition. The human need for water is matched in the minds of many by the need for companionship, enshrined in this quiet corner of the castle, where the garden has been used since the 1840s as a cemetery for officers' pet dogs and regimental mascots. The great rebuilding of the castle
which had been partly repaired by the English, who regained possession following the death of Robert the Bruce and then lost it again in 1341, was undertaken by Bruce's son, King David II, when he returned to his homeland from a 10-year captivity in England in 1356. This is what little remains of David's Tower, his secure royal residence of the rebuilt castle. In this hole, the crown jewels were hidden during the Second World War. The massive, thick walls bristled with arrow slits, for this was the main defense towards the city. From the outside, the mighty L-shaped tower stood over 30 meters to crown the eastern crag, just as it was depicted by an English spy in his drawing of 1544.
The tower is thought to have been the scene of the macabre and infamous Black Dinner of 1440, when the teenaged 6th Earl of Douglas and his younger brother were invited to dine with the young King James II. The dinner over, both were deliberately and falsely accused of treachery, taken into the castle courtyard and beheaded.
The precious ruins of David's Tower are entombed below the vast sweep of the Half Moon Battery, which today symbolizes the castle and replaced the tower after it was brought crashing down during a mighty artillery bombardment in May 1573. The bombardment marked the end of the Lang siege, which had lasted for 2 years. Sir William Kirkcaldy of Grange had been keeper of the castle and supported the exiled Mary Queen of Scots. He was besieged by the Regent Morton, governing on behalf of the young King James VI. A large force with heavy artillery, sent at Morton's request by Queen Elizabeth of England, rained an attack on the castle for 11 days, destroying most of the eastern defences in a punishing and devastating bombardment. Kirkcaldy surrendered and was executed. Instead of rebuilding David's Tower, Morton built a new high-level defence of the vulnerable eastern front with 9 gun embrasures to cover the Royal Mile approach. Although the Half Moon Battery was damaged in 2 17th century sieges, it was repaired and today looks much as it did 400 years ago.
Our journey upwards and through time has brought us to the heart of the castle. High on the summit of the rock, we're in Crown Square, conceived in the 15th century as the courtyard of the royal fortress. It's surrounded on its 4 sides by buildings which reflect or stand on the site of structures which represented the 4 great necessities of life.
And so the heart of the castle beats as one with the nation, whose story it shares and whose great moments it has witnessed. On the morning of Wednesday, June the 19th, 1566, Mary, Queen of Scots, gave birth in this cramped little chamber of the royal palace to a baby prince who would live to unite 2 crowns as James VI of Scotland and James I of England. The exposed castle was never a favourite residence of Scotland's royalty. As with Mary's confinement, they stayed here only when protocol or their safety demanded it. James VI of Scotland acceded to the English throne in 1603. He returned to his native land but once. The royal palace, which had been severely damaged in the Lang siege, was lavishly remodelled for his emotional homecoming in 1617. The showpiece east front, built of fine ashlar, was crowned with a battlemented parapet topped with square turrets. Inside, the great chamber was divided into 2 rooms, currently being refurbished and to be known as the Lake Hall and Presence Chamber. Of all the many decorations added for the king's pleasure, only this embellishment remains, in the little room where he first drew breath. The refurbishment included a strong room to house the honours of Scotland, the nation's crown jewels, and the oldest regalia in the United Kingdom. After an eventful history, they are still displayed here. The honours were locked away in a chest and the doors to the room walled up after the Act of 1707, which united the parliaments of Scotland and England. Virtually forgotten for 111 years, the ancient regalia were rediscovered when the novelist Walter Scott was granted permission by the Prince Regent to break into the room in 1818. And it was the rediscovery that led to the name Crown Square being adopted. The courtyard was formerly known as Grand Parade, and before that, Palace Yard. The crown, sword and sceptre date from the 15th and early 16th century and were first presented to the infant Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1543 at her coronation ceremony in Stirling Castle when she was only 9 months old. The famous Stone of Destiny, used for coronations on the ancient Moot Hill at Scone, was taken south of the border from Scone by Edward I in 1296. On the 700th anniversary of that event, on St Andrew's Day, 1996, the stone was handed back to Scotland by Prince Andrew in the Great Hall and lodged here in the Crown Room in the castle. Also on display in the Crown Room are the Order of the Thistle and the Order of the Garter. The Great Hall in Crown Square, built at the beginning of the 16th century for James IV, grandfather of Mary, Queen of Scots, was the scene of great and glittering occasions. Cromwell converted it into a barracks, and it became a military hospital until 1887, when the Victorian architect Hippolyte Blanc saw to its restoration. Consequently, most of what can be seen today, from the Gothic timber panelling to the heraldic shields, is his work, but the remarkable medieval hammer-beam roof remains. The carvings on the stone corbels are probably the earliest Renaissance architectural ornament in Scotland. The monogram refers to James IV. The urn, with a red rose flanked by 2 thistles, symbolizes the marriage in 1503 of James to Margaret Tudor of England. This marriage resulted in James VI of Scotland becoming James I of England also. The tiny barred window is a laird's lug, a peephole from which the king could spy on his subjects. The construction of Castle Square was a monumental task. The platform on which it stands was formed by building 2 tiers of great stone vaults on the south-facing slope of the rock. The vaults have been put to a variety of military and domestic uses since the 15th century, but most memorably as prisons of war. French, Spanish, Dutch, German, Italian, Irish and American prisoners were all held in the shadowy world beneath the square. From the 7 Years' War to the American fight for independence, and to the wars with revolutionary and Napoleonic France, the captives demonstrated their ingenuity and left their mark for posterity. Mons Meg left a mark as well. One of 2 giant siege guns presented to King James II in 1457 by his uncle by marriage, Philip of Burgundy, the great muzzle-loading piece is now displayed in the vaults. She was made at Mons in what is now Belgium. With a weight of over 6 tons, she could fire gunstones of 330 pounds, but her giant size rendered her ponderously slow, and she was eventually restricted to firing salutes. There can be few places in the world where those who have fallen in battle are remembered with more poignancy than the Scottish National War Memorial overlooking Crown Square from the north. Rich in symbolism and deeply moving in its totality, the memorial reflects the work of Scotland's finest craftsmen and women. It was created between 1925 and 1927 by the nation's great architect Sir Robert Lorimer from the stone of the soldiers' barracks, which had stood here since 1755 on the site of the medieval Church of St Mary. From within the Hall of Honour, the stained glass windows tell their story of war. The steel casket within the apse contains a continuous scroll of honour with 150,000 names. The shrine stands where the volcanic rock protrudes through the floor to reach its highest point. Originally opened to commemorate the Scottish dead of the 1914-18 Great War, the memorial now also commemorates those who fell in the Second World War and in campaign areas since 1945. In this way, Scotland remembers. The spectacle of the annual tattoo imprints an unforgettable picture of Edinburgh and its castle in the minds of millions. The pipes and drums are a reminder not only that this is a living castle, but that it has a long history as a garrison fortress. The military connection continues to the present day. Fortress, garrison, royal residence, maker of history, symbol of a nation. The Castle of Edinburgh belongs to Scotland's past, present and future. And 340 million years on, the Castle Rock dominates the landscape, as it always has and always will, a witness to the endless passing of time.